I just set the land speed record going from downtown Princeton to Moorestown, 35 minutes, because I was up there talking to the Nassau Club of Princeton. And it was a room about half the size of this one, and it was filled, and the average age was 78. These guys sit around reading their Wall Street journals and their New York Times and talking about philosophy. And when I was on my way up there, I said, well, I think I'll check and see if anyone in my audience was in the service during World War II. And it turned out that 90% of these guys were around during World War II, participated, knew all about it. And what I talked about was a couple of USS Princetons. The cruiser Princeton that you folks built was the 6th in the series of Princetons. And I learned all about all of them when I was in the pre-commissioning mode back 4 years ago. In fact, I came up here, did the obligatory tour of the facilities here at Moorestown, and then went up to Princeton, paid a call on the president of the university and gave him a ball cap, paid a call on the mayors of the borough and the township, and went and drove through the battlefield and got the lay of the land. And it was the beginning of a really fantastic association with some really good people, including Senator Bradley, whose mother christened the ship in 1987, and the senator himself, who after hearing from his mother what a great time she had at the christening, decided that he would accept our invitation to the commissioning. He gave a great speech, as some of you may know, and put the ship in commission back in February of '89. And this at noon today, when I was talking to the Princeton Club, the Nassau Club of these old timers, I lapsed back and told them a little bit about the first Princeton, which was the first screw-driven steamship in the Navy back in the 1840s. And the reason the ship was named Princeton was because the captain of the ship was the guy through whose efforts the ship was built, and some innovative things were put into it, and he happened to have been from Princeton. In fact, there's a Stockton house right along the main drag through Princeton that he lived in. And of course, I guess back then the COs had a little more flexibility than they do now, but he got to name his own ship. But that first Princeton was the test platform for a new gun which was called the Peacemaker. And if you remember the history, at one point Captain Stockton took Princeton up the Potomac River, embarked the president, a number of members of the cabinet, and as part of his demonstrations test-fired his big Peacemaker gun. And on the third firing of the gun exploded, killed several people, including the Secretary of the Navy, and in so doing set an extremely bad precedence for the Princetons to follow, because there were 2 more Princetons after that got themselves in trouble in one way or another. The second one that got itself in trouble was the aircraft carrier Princeton CVL-23, and I'm going to talk about that one, and then I'm going to talk about the cruiser. CVL-23, light aircraft carrier, was laid down on a cruiser hull early in World War II and was commissioned in Philadelphia by the wife of the president of Princeton University in February 1943. And after the normal crew and air wing workups, the ship proceeded to the South Pacific, where she started her first war patrol in August of 1943, just 6 months after commissioning. And over the ensuing 14 months prior to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Princeton was either operating or preparing to operate. She was on an extremely busy schedule, either going to sea or preparing to go to sea, pretty much the way we operate our ships today. Well, there was a fatal day coming up for the carrier Princeton. And that day in October 1944, was pretty much like any other day at war. The cooks were preparing their meals. The engineers were producing the steam that operated the engines and the generators. The aviators were preparing to fly and flying. And the guys down the ship's office were banging away on their old manual Remington typewriters, turning out the letters just like they did every other day. It was a routine day at war, and the fact that the ship had been participating in a variety of battles over a year's period was just indicative of the fact that this crew, which was pretty well in the groove, they were some real combat veterans. And then at 0938 on the morning of October 24th, 1944, those who were topside on the ship watched a single Japanese plane approach, which somehow made it through all the layered defenses of the battle forces, which back then were even more layered than they are now, and there were hundreds of ships that participated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And as the ship approached, it dropped a single 550-pound bomb, which made a direct hit right on the flight deck. And actually it went through the flight deck, it went through the hangar deck, and it exploded on the second deck below. Well, the captain was on the bridge, and he's watched this bomb hit his deck, and he looks down, and he sees a 1.5-foot hole in his deck. And his immediate reaction is, let's get that hole fixed and let's get operating. In fact, he reported up the chain of command that the damage was minor and that he would be resuming flight ops shortly after he placed a patch over the hole in his deck. Well, unbeknownst to him, the fires were already raging below decks, out of sight. Well, from there, the story of Princeton CVL-23 is pretty much a classic of naval history. It was an all-day battle against fire and smoke, personal heroism and sacrifice, all of which culminated in the explosion of the after magazine of the ship, which not only blew off the stern of Princeton, but killed several hundred men on the cruiser Birmingham, which was alongside fighting fires at the time. Well, this terrible tragedy has been memorialized in several books. In fact, there's even been a movie made which depicted the efforts of the all-day battle to save the ship. The point I want to get across early on is to point out that the commanding officer of this Princeton took a hit, surveyed the damage, and his immediate reaction was that he would be operating shortly and that things were relatively minor. He ended up losing his ship. Now contrast that with the experience of the cruiser Princeton, CG-59. On 18 February, 14 months ago, we were assigned as the local anti-air warfare commander for the northern Persian Gulf, protecting the minesweeping and NGFS forces which were preparing for a potential amphibious landing in Kuwait or northern Saudi Arabia. Let me set the stage. Sea state is 1, dead calm. 6 knots of wind were blowing out of the southeast. Air temperature was 60 degrees. Modified material conditions Zebra was set on the main deck and below to provide the best watertight integrity. And what that means is that we closed the various doors and hatches which gave us better watertight integrity. And normal peacetime steaming, those doors and hatches would be open. When you go to general quarters, you close them up all over the ship. When we were in the area where we thought we had mines, we set that increased condition on the main deck and below so that if we struck a mine, we already were pretty well set for watertight integrity. Air warning red had been set, and as the local AAW commander, I'm the one that set it, based on an intelligence report that indicated that an Iraqi Silkworm missile site had been activated along the coast of Kuwait, and I positioned Princeton so that we would be in a direct line between that silkworm site and the minesweeping forces that we were due to protect. And as I think probably a lot of you know, the silkworm is a relatively easy target for the Aegis system, and I was fully prepared to take that on if they shot it at us. Of all the various threats that we could face, if I had to pick one I'd like them to shoot at me, I'd probably pick the silkworm. It's a good target. We had Condition 3 watches set. That's the next stage below general quarters, but enhanced from what normal peacetime steaming would provide. So the Combat Information Center and the engineering teams and throughout the ship, we were at a fairly alert position, ready for whatever might come. All 4 main engines were on the line. 2 generators were on the line, and the ship was making 3 knots through the water. People have asked me, if you're only doing 3 knots through the water, why did you have 4 engines on the line? And the answer simply is I was doing 3 knots throughout the night prior to striking the mine because I wanted to reduce my speed through the water just so that we wouldn't run into anything such as a mine. But I wanted to have full speed available should I have to maneuver due to an attack from the silkworm. So it was a maximum readiness condition. So we were doing 3 knots, and the water was only 50 feet deep. The ship draws about 33 or so, so I had about 15 feet of excess water, which isn't very much, especially when you look out and you can't see land anywhere, but actually you're pretty close to the bottom. Another good reason to go fairly slow, because I'll tell you what, if you're the captain of the ship, running aground is probably worse than running over a mine. You know, you don't want to ding those screws, and you don't want to mess up your sonar dome. And it's kind of interesting to note, as just for perspective, that the channel leading into our home port in Long Beach is greater than 50 feet deep, and that's about the depth of the water leading into Norfolk. So we were in relatively restricted water. At exactly 07:16 on the morning of 18 February, I was talking on the 1MC announcing system, giving my crew their daily operational briefing. Get them up to speed, let them know what's going on, give them any particulars of the schedule, let them know I cared. And just as I told them about the Tripoli striking a mine 3 hours earlier, the whole ship seemed to raise up into the air. And we went up on the bridge, it felt like we went up maybe 4 to 6 feet. And then a second later, the bottom dropped out and we dropped back down. And then the ship began severe whiplashing. Lasted for 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds. Up and down, up and down, up and down. And then after a little while, we got some lateral motion, which initially I didn't know where it came from. Later, we got a report from one of our people that there was another mine that went off a couple hundred yards off the starboard bow, and so I blamed that lateral motion on the second mine. But then I was told by the experts, and Tom Pugh's over here, and he's one of those guys that said, nah, it couldn't happen like that. I'm telling you, we went sideways. And it probably was due to the shallow water reverberations, if it wasn't due to the second mine. But we're going up and down, doing some pretty healthy deep knee bends, and then we're going sideways. Those of us that were on the bridge were hanging on to whatever we could grab. I grabbed a hold of the chart table, which was right in front of me. And at the end of the 6 and 7 seconds of this up and down motion, then the lateral motion, then we had this terrible shuddering that started. And it was a kind of a bone-crushing, metal-bending type of thing that made me think that, my God, the ship is going to come apart. You know, and that's, in some respects, exactly what was happening. Well, only a second or two after the mine strike, my reaction was, okay, you go up, you come back down. That's what a mine is supposed to do. Convinced that anybody that stays in the Navy long enough to become a captain has got idiosyncrasies and their own little quirks. And one of mine is the fact that from the time I was an ensign, I could not understand why when we did our training and went to refresher training and did our workups, we actually spent a fair amount of time practicing to abandon ship in the proper manner. So I developed my own little thing, is that I wasn't going to do abandoned ship drills any more than the absolute necessity, because I thought we would be better off spending our time learning how to fight the ship and shoot the missiles and doing other kinds of self-preservation drills rather than practicing to abandon ship and don't forget to take a hat so you don't get sunburned, and learning where the nearest land was and how to get into the boats and all those things that have to be done. Well, one of my very first reactions after the mine was that God is getting me for not doing abandoned ship drills, and now we're going to have to do it for real. Well, the bosun mate, the watch, and I, at this point, both reached for the GQ alarm, but the crew was already on their way to their GQ stations. And for some, it was easier than others. There was one fella who was on the main deck amidships who headed up to the 03 level to go forward into the deck house to his GQ station. And when he was halfway across the 03 level, he heard what sounded like a shotgun blast going off in his ear. And in front of him, he watched the entire deck tear in half and pull open. And as the ship whiplashed back and forth, he watched the deck in front of him opening and closing. He turned around and went back where he came from, because he was not going to go across that crack that was opening and closing. And he also, like me, thought, uh-oh, the ship is coming apart. What happened was that the ship went through what I just call the beer can effect. And just like you can take a beer can and give it this business for 6 or 7 cycles, and you can rip it in half. When the mine went off underneath the stern of the ship, it was just like twanging a bar, and the ship resonated and whiplashed at what I think the engineers have calculated to be a 1 hertz rate. And the superstructure at the fulcrum went through this bending back and forth, and at about the time I calculate we got the lateral motion was when the whole thing just popped and broke in half. The 03 level at that point where it does that is right at it's the overhead of Radio Central. So from the inside, the guys in Radio Central are in there. The ship is moving around, and they're watching the bulkheads moving back and forth, and then they start seeing daylight through the crack when the ship opens up. There was another fella who was in his berthing compartment at 7:15 in the morning. There were a number of guys that were still in their racks, and people were just rolling out. That fella got his nose caught in his bunk light, which sounded funny, but it wasn't funny to him. My systems test officer, a crusty old LDO, was in his stateroom in after officers country, and when the motion of the ship started, his reaction was to get up and get going, and the motion was continuing. He opened his door to head out into the passageway to go to his GQ station, and right across from his stateroom is an aluminum bulkhead. And he said that bulkhead was flexing back and forth, and he said it looked like a monster movie where the monster's trying to push himself through a wall or a bulkhead, and it was bending back and forth. He said he didn't know what to do. He turned around, went back into his stateroom, closed the door, counted to 5, and tried it again, by which time the motion had settled down enough that he felt safe heading for his GQ station. There were several personnel injuries, but no fatalities. The worst motion on the ship was at the bow and stern, and the closer you were to either, the more motion you felt. There was one fellow on watch at the EP2 panel, the gun control panel, underneath Mount 52, which is right in the middle of the fantail, which is right where it happened. He was sitting at his panel when the mine hit, and the whiplashing threw him into the overhead 3 times. Banged him up pretty bad, and we ended up medevacing him. He turned out to be fine. There were 3 guys back aft in the laundry, and they all went airborne once or twice. And there were a couple of other instances of that. The most serious injury was on the forecastle, where there were 2 people right on the bullnose. One was a sailor sitting in a mine watch chair that we had built up. Most of the ships had rigged up a chair right at the forward part of the ship where they could basically look right down over the bullnose at the water looking for mines. And we had built a sunscreen on this chair, and so he's sitting in this chair, and when the ship whiplashed, he gets thrown into this sunscreen, and so he's bouncing off this sunscreen, getting thrown back down, bouncing again, and he finally got thrown out of his chair and into the bulwark in front of the chair. He turned out to be okay, but was banged up enough that we medevaced him. The most serious injury, though, was to a sailor who was standing beside the fellow in the chair, and he was manning the 50 caliber guns. When the ship began to whiplash for him, it threw him 10 feet into the air, which gives you an indication of the amount of energy that went into whiplashing this ship. And he did a flip, ended up landing on his head on one of the bits, shattered a knee, lost a lot of blood, but ended up okay. He still has some leg problems. We medevaced him, and he spent a few days on the British hospital ship that was in the vicinity. But those 3 people were the only ones who were medevaced, and all 3 of those fellas received a Purple Heart. There were other guys with broken noses and scratches and cuts and bruises and sprained ankles, but nothing that turned out to be serious. And so they weren't medevaced. It turns out that the way the rules and regulations read on Purple Hearts is that you have to see a medical officer, and if you don't see a medical officer, a doctor, you don't get a Purple Heart. So the 3 guys we sent to the British hospital ship saw doctors, got their Purple Hearts, and the rest just have their memories. And I don't think anybody was particularly disappointed that there weren't a lot of people getting Purple Hearts. Well, back to the bridge where I was, as I said, I was convinced we were in serious trouble. So I grabbed my handheld bridge-to-bridge radio because I assumed that would be the only emergency communications we would have. It was battery operated, and I was sure that the lights would go out and the generators would shut down, and that we were going to go cold and dark, as we call it. Well, I went out to the bridge wing, and I made my distress call all right, but so did about 10 or 15 other guys in CIC on their individual radio circuits. Amazingly, the lights didn't go out, and the ship didn't go cold and dark. Both generators stayed on the line, and so did all 4 main engines. And I got to tell you that was the first of the good news that continued throughout the day, following what was about 8 or 10 seconds of bad news. We had a fair amount of damage throughout the ship, and initially we weren't sure what we had until we went through the investigative process. But when the mine went off, it went off directly underneath the screws at the stern of the ship. And we know that because we had 2 people that were looking aft, saw the plume of water come out on one side, and saw the bubbling water on the other side. And the fellows reported that as they looked aft, they watched the stern of the ship bend up to the point where they could see the bits and various things that were on the deck of the fantail that you normally can't see until you walk well aft to the missile deck and look down. So what happened is the fantail hinged on the keel, and the keel remained intact, but the rest of it bent up like this. And when it did that, it compressed and crunched all the I-beams that are the strength members that hold the fantail onto the rest of the ship. And at frame 472, where the ship folded, is the section, it's the point where the fantail module that's built as a module is welded onto the rest of the ship. Well, when the fantail folded up and it crunched all those I-beams, it also crunched everything else that happened to be at frame 472, some of which were things such as the fire main, the chill water main, both of which were broken enough that there were massive leaks. Now the fire main break was right above the number 3 switchboard, and so we're pouring salt water at the rate of 500 or 1,000 gallons a minute out of this break onto the switchboard. And when the investigator got there, he saw exactly what we had, reported it, and the people at the EPSI panel in the central control just simply punched out that switchboard from central control and isolated the switchboard, which meant all the lights go out in the after part of the ship. And so now we've got flooding going on, the lights are out. Because the generators stayed on the line, we didn't lose our fire pumps, all of which are electrical. And when we lost pressure on the fire main, the procedure is to bring up more fire pumps. And so we brought up more fire pumps, and we pumped as much water out of that hole in the fire main as we could onto the number 3 switchboard. And of course the chill water line is also putting water into the switchboard room. The pallet staging area, which is directly below the switchboard room and in the vicinity where this sailor was sitting at his EP2 panel, was one of the areas that the investigators had to go and look for damage. And when the investigators got there, of course it was dark, and he's using his emergency lights, and he goes into the space, and it's raining. The sprinklers have lit off because the heat-sensitive fusible link, which melts when it gets hot and sets off the sprinklers, broke due to the shock and set the sprinklers off. So the sprinklers are going off in the pallet staging area. And as he walks across the deck doing his investigation, he falls through a hole in the deck, and it's a mixture of oil and water, and the oil, of course, is you're easy to tell when you got fuel oil around. And so he's got salt water and fuel oil all mixed together, and he reports back that we've got some massive damage. The ship's been blown apart, and he's got a hole in the deck. Well, we got him out of there, did some reinvestigations, and I looked over the side and saw no fuel oil in the water, which is what I would have expected had we been torn apart under the water back aft. Saw no such indication. So they went back in and reinvestigated, and it turns out that the ship was relatively intact, and what this sailor, the hole the sailor had stepped into, was where the tank top from the fuel tank had popped out and was blown away due to the hydraulic pressure from the mine, which, unlike the Stark or the Samuel B. Roberts and the Tripoli, did not tear a hole through the side of the ship, but the energy was spread out over the entire fantail because it was an influence mine and not a contact mine. So that energy was spread out, and that's why it was able to force the fantail up, but also dished in the hull plates with tremendous hydraulic pressure being put on those fuel tanks, which had to be relieved somewhere. Luckily, those manhole tank covers popped, and the seams in the fuel tanks did not. Well, after it was all over, the engineers came aboard and checked this stuff out, and the experts looked, and they determined that these tank top covers were not supposed to fail. And we looked at the drawings, and there's a fillet weld that goes around one side, and there's a fillet weld that goes around the other side. Only these tank tops only had one fillet weld, and so they were improperly constructed, which is one of the more fortunate things that has happened, because had we split the fuel tanks, it would have taken us considerably longer to get the ship back into condition once we were in the shipyard at Dubai. Well, the bottom line on the good news side of the ledger that I was talking about was that in spite of the broken piping and the flooded spaces and the massive damage to the ship and the several personnel injuries, there were no fatalities. And unlike the Princeton CVL-23, the ship not only didn't sink, but it remained a viable warship, even though it had sustained major damage. Well, this outcome and this comparison was not due to luck. It was due to hard work, long-range planning, hard work, intensive training, hard work, good systems engineering, and lastly, hard work. Unlike the situation in 1944, I was blessed with a crew who had trained for the exact event that occurred. They trained on where to go, what to do, what equipment to employ, what to wear, what reports to make, all the exacting details necessary to save the ship and save the crew. Not only didn't Princeton sink, but within an hour and a half of the mine strike, the chill water piping had been repaired, and the combat system was on the line with the Spy-1B radar operating, forward missile launcher authorized, and the forward 5-inch gun back on the line. While the after steering crew was trying to restore the jammed rudder, the CIC team reassumed duties as the local anti-air warfare commander, even though we were sitting dead in the water in the middle of a minefield. We remained the most capable AAW ship in the area. How could this be? Well, unlike the carrier Princeton in 1944, the cruiser Princeton was designed to strike a mine and keep on operating. The Navy shock test program paid off in spades. As I'm sure most of you know, Yorktown, the second ship of the class, was sent through shock trials shortly after commissioning. And with a much smaller explosion than we felt on Princeton, her generators shut down, she went cold and dark, and a lot of equipment throughout the ship received damage. But then, a team of engineers, some of you probably included, combed the data and designed and built the fixes into the following ships in order to eliminate the cheap kills which have been on every ship that we've ever built. And these fixes were validated and in some cases re-engineered as a result of the shock test trials on the Mobile Bay a couple of years later. So when I say the ship was designed to strike a mine, that is a true statement. And without this engineering work, our generators would have shut down, and our fire pumps, all of which are electric, would not have been available. And we would have had only an emergency capability to dewater our spaces. And, oh yes, we would have had no combat systems capability whatsoever. Extraordinary leadership on my part to get the guys motivated to prepare for that. And we all reviewed the shock trial films from the Mobile Bay, and the fact that my XO, Lieutenant Commander Jim Keir, had been XO on Mobile Bay during those shock trials was a real boon to getting the word out to the troops. So we went about our business. We tied down everything that might become a missile hazard. We did white glove inspections on on all the computers and radar and electronics equipment and cabinets, and we made sure that they were free of debris as best we could, and we got rid of the types of things that caused the cheap kills on the ships during the shock trials. We also did battle preparation PMS. Most people don't realize that for the Aegis weapon system, there are when required R checks, as we call them, which are to be completed on the ship prior to entering combat. Well, we knew about those. We read the book and we knew we were entering combat, so we did the PMS. And this is the type of thing that included tightening screws and torquing down bolts and getting everything into like new specifications so that everything would work as designed and not be degraded through just the fact that it had been on the ship for a while and was aging. And of course, we trained ourselves at Condition 3 watchstanding and at general quarters. And we practiced against missile hits and mine hits. And we fought fires and we fought floods. And we restored engines and we restored generators and computers. And in all the scenarios where we did this training, we combined combat systems casualty control drills with damage control drills. Some of you old Navy vets may remember in the old days where you would do damage control and engineering drills, you would pass the word, place all electronics equipment in standby. And so you'd turn off the electronics, you'd go about your drills, and no one would have any idea what would happen to the electronics during combat type situations. We don't do that anymore. We do coordinated training, which we call CSOS Stage 3, or Total Ship Survivability, and we try to implant a mentality into our combat systems operators that you're going to keep your systems on the line after the ship takes a hit, and that if you don't have a fire or flooding in your immediate vicinity after you take a hit, then your job is to get your combat systems back on the line and operating. So over and over and over again, we went to general quarters to train. And at about the time everyone was sick of it, that's when we started to reach the point where we had imbued the old gunnery discipline level of training into our people. And things were getting into automatic. And people knew where to go and what to do. And they'd done it so often that they could do it in their sleep. Or, as it turns out, under the stress of combat. So if there's a bottom line to all this, it's that both the ship and the crew perform superbly. It's my observation, after comparing the two Princetons and what happened in wartime, that our forebears in World War II had neither the equipment or the people or the training or the standards that we have today. And as a result of that difference, the Stark, the Samuel B. Roberts, the Tripoli, and the Princeton are still with us. And if you read your World War II history, the slot up through the Solomons is littered with sunken ships to the point where it's known as the Iron Bottom Sound. We no longer fight our wars where attrition is the accepted philosophy. Our ships and our people are more expensive and more dear than that. We preserve them, and we have obviously designed and built our ships in that manner, and I think we are training and imbuing those same principles into our crew so that we can do our jobs and we can save our ships and bring all the troops home. Thank you very much, and I'd be glad to take some questions if you have any questions. I think the estimate was somewhere in the 500 pounds of TNT range, but I'm really not sure.
You could change 3 ships and three things in the Aegis cruiser. Don't
Well, you know, I'd rather had a steel superstructure than an aluminum one, so I think we've got that one. Some things that can be done. It's kind of interesting that when the lights went out after we secured the number 3 switchboard, that secured all the non-vital lighting that was fed from that switchboard. All the hotel service in that part of the ship, all the 120 volt, 60 hertz outlets throughout the ship were fed from that switchboard. So, and of course, we kept operating the ship, and we lived on the ship for several weeks after that. We had to string our up and over security lights throughout the wardroom area and the passageways because we had no way of getting alternate power to those circuits. We had to rig emergency power and jury rig the systems in order to power up the galley so that we could cook our food. And the combat systems guys, who immediately after the mine strike had to check out all their equipment, grab your portable test equipment and you plug it in and you get nothing. So it's not just hotel services and non-vital. Some of that 60 hertz convenience outlets fall into the vital category, and so I think as we can continue with the continuous upgrade of the survivability mods in the electrical area. And a third item, that when the chill water line was ruptured in 2 different places, one up by radio and one back aft at frame 472, in order to do the repairs, we had to isolate the line and get the water out of it. One of the real problems with these ships that we've known about forever but haven't come up with a solution is that we have butterfly valves in our fire main and in our chill water main, which are unsatisfactory due to the leak by, and it is extremely difficult to isolate those mains, and so you end up securing the entire system in order to fix a small area. I don't know what we're going to do about it, but something ought to be done. And this was just the latest in a series of indications that that's a problem. We didn't have to shoot missiles, and I have no reason to believe that the system wouldn't have worked had I done it. Although I'm glad I didn't have to, and I still haven't gotten the report back to find out what the canisters, the rocket motors on the missiles looked like, and whether that would have worked. So I don't have any combat systems recommendations there as a result of the mine strike.
Captain, you mentioned the luck, I guess, of the single fillet weld on the covers for the fuel tanks and acting as a pressure relief valve. On frame 472, it was also a weld joint as the ship is built. Was that do you know if that's a design parameter for that to be a bend area, or just?
I don't think anyone ever planned on this. No, the ship has no expansion joints, which is kind of interesting, and as I'm sure you know, the superstructures in these ships have been plagued with cracking at various places. But without an expansion joint, if you have the kind of severe motion that we have, the pressure is going to relieve itself somewhere. And of course, we got cracking in the superstructure that was at all the normal places, in addition to the tear that broke the whole deck house in half. But I'm not sure expansion joints would have done any good. So I don't make any comments about expansion joints. But I'm sure that they didn't design the fantail for what happened. I was really afraid. We were afraid that there was an engineer that came aboard fairly quickly. Had a computer program which he put into a PC, went down, surveyed the damage area back there, and came back within minutes and said, our calculation shows that you've lost 80% of your structural strength at frame 472. And you know, we have good and watertight integrity, but I was afraid that the fantail, not that it would fall off and go in the water, because we could have survived that it would hang down on the keel again and fill up with water and then I don't know what would have happened, and I don't know if anybody's looked at that, but we were awfully concerned and went into Bahrain. We ducked in there when the weather started picked up as we were heading south and welded 8 12-inch I-beams across the cracked area to strengthen up that area before we got towed down to Dubai.
What did the guys in CIC see and think, and how long before they knew exactly what had happened?
I think almost everybody knew that we'd struck a mine within seconds. You know, there was somebody that said they thought we took a missile hit, but the motion, everyone knew it. We had been in the northern part of the Gulf for over a week. We had found several mines, and when you'd find a mine, you'd call the EOD people that were on one of the ships. They'd come out, put the divers in the water. They'd put some explosives on it, back off, and they'd blow it up. And we got everybody topside to watch when they did that because I wanted to impress upon everybody the strength of the explosions, which motivated a lot more people to come up and be mine watches topside. And I encouraged volunteers to be mine watches, and guys were out there all the time. We ran out of binoculars, had to put a call out to people to volunteer their personal binoculars. And one of the mines we found, you know, my first class yeoman was on his lunch break, and he came up there and was out there looking through the big eyes and found one. But in CIC, you know, there were some fairly cryptic comments that were made over the circuits. I found out later, people saying, "Hey, your guys sounded scared." Well, better believe that my guys were scared. Yeah, they didn't know what was going to happen either. It was pretty violent, and the guys all made some kind of emergency calls on their radios. We were controlling aircraft at the time that were conducting attacks on Iraqi shipping up to the north. And so we had to hand over the ships, or the airplanes that we had under our control to the Horn. We also handed over the anti-air warfare commander duties to the Horn. But yeah, everybody pretty much knew fairly quickly what happened. The ship is up and operating out of the home port of Long Beach. We spent 6 or 7 weeks in Dubai dry dock where they did all the repairs to the underwater hull. When the ship came back last summer, they went into a 4-month SRA, which was twice as long as it had originally been planned for, and replaced the gun mount, did the combat systems alignment, made all the final repairs. And then after they came out of the shipyard, they went out, did a sea squat, shot some missiles, and they're now doing their training and workups, getting ready for their next deployment. So they're basically back online. Okay, thank you very much. Hi, Mike.